today to introduce my second keynote speaker, Professor Chandra Bhatt. Chandra is a leading expert in travel demand modeling and travel behavior analysis. He's a distinguished university teaching professor and Joe King Chair in Engineering since September 2017. Professor Bhatt is presently the Director of Data Supported Transportation Operations and Planning, DSTOP, at the University of Texas at Austin. Chandra has received several career awards. I'm not going to list them, otherwise he won't have time to give his presentation. Just I'll note one of them: Lifetime Achievements in Transportation Research and Education Award from the Council of University Transportation Center, and many others, many others. In travel demand modeling and activity-based travel modeling, he also had authored several book chapters focusing on improved methods for choice modeling and land use travel demand modeling. Professor Bhatt is editor-in-chief for Transportation Research Part B, which is the strongest journal for us, since January 2019. He is amongst the top 5 cited researchers in the combined field of logistics and transportation, a top 3 leading transportation authors in terms of papers and citations published in Transportation Research Part B, and the #1 ranked transportation author in terms of most number of papers, with more than 300 citations and more than 100 citations in Transportation Research Part B. As I said, I've got a long list of awards and achievements in the last 5 years, but I'm sure we all know Professor Bhatt.
Well, thank you so much, Wafa, and it's a pleasure to be amongst all of you. I do want to thank Wafa for organizing this conference with the overall theme on transportation and equity. This is a theme that is receiving a lot of attention, has received a lot of attention over the past couple of years. In some ways, very long overdue, and I believe it's kind of a travesty that we haven't spoken as much about this in the past, and all of us, I think, are guilty of not raising this issue earlier. In the United States, we have been talking about equity considerations quite a bit, again, over the past 3 or 4 years, and there has been research in this area for quite a bit of time, but dare I say that we should have started talking about this way back. So thanks to Wafa for raising awareness, if you will, on this topic. So I do want to acknowledge my 2 graduate students, Angela Haddad and Aupal Mondal. Both of them and I, we are involved in an effort, a university-wide effort here at the University of Texas at Austin, which is referred to as Good Systems. And what we are focusing on is fairness and ethics issues as artificial intelligence techniques seems to take hold of our lives. So, I do want to acknowledge Good Systems at the University of Texas as well as my students. So what I'm going to do is try to go through this relatively quickly so there can be some time for questions and discussions. This is an open topic, and I would certainly love to hear any thoughts and feedback from the distinguished attendees of this conference. So I'm going to try to run through my presentation relatively fast and keep some time open for discussions. So this is the agenda. I do want to start with mobility justice and racial justice. That's a long history of interlinkage, and I'm sure we can identify these linkages in pretty much every country. In the United States, the civil rights movement started with Rosa Parks in December 1995 refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. And before that, Claudette Colvin actually, based on records, was the first Black woman. She was a teenager at that time. I mean, unbelievable courage. She was the first one to refuse to give up her seat. But the civil rights movement has the face of Rosa Parks. And that led to a one-year Montgomery bus boycott. And we all know what happened after that. About a year after that, November 13, 1956, the US Supreme Court struck down the Alabama State and Montgomery City bus segregation policy. So what I'm trying to say is mobility justice is racial justice. The two of them are strongly interlinked, and originations of many civil rights movements started with mobility justice. Now, not to say that this immediately led to equity, by no means. The interstate highway was the act was enacted in the same year, actually the next year after 1955, and the focus was on inexpensive methods of easing congestion. And not surprisingly, while the interstate highway system in the United States has been, and correctly so, been given a lot of recognition for economic development and quality of life, it also did racially divide the country and led to inequitable benefits across racial groups. Not surprisingly, the interstate system, by many accords, was built in some way to preserve segregation. So some of these motives were incorporated, at least based on most scholars who have studied this issue. Many positive things from the interstate highway planning system, but there were some of these other malicious intents also built in, it appears, in the interstate highway. So that was 1956, and much earlier. But have things changed today? That is the debate that we are starting to have, and I think a very healthy debate today. When you look at our transportation systems, there is insufficient walking and rolling infrastructure in Black communities, higher rates of injuries and fatalities. Black pedestrians are likely to be overrepresented in the pool of pedestrian fatalities. And the real question that we are trying to ask over here is, how much of this is exposure? How much of this is poor walking facilities? How much of this might be related to what we are calling social resistance? And how much of this might be absolute, true, unhinged prejudice that still exists in terms of investments in our transportation infrastructure, or at least inequitable investments. So we all know the Black Lives Matter movement, which brought to the fore many of these inequity considerations in many different walks of life. And certainly this also seems to apply to transportation safety. So let's look at what's happening in that front. So let's first look at the state of pedestrian safety in the United States. And what you can see over here is, very interestingly, there's been a jump in the number of pedestrian fatalities over the past 3 or 4 years. The jump between 2019 to 2020 was a little bit less, actually, maybe even a small decrease. But when you look at the, a longer term, it is interesting that even as our overall roadway fatalities have been decreasing, that cannot be said about pedestrian fatalities. So, and you can see that fatalities have increased by 45% over the past decade, while the walking trip share has remained constant at 10.5%. And yes, these are all statistics based on the United States. I do know that some countries in Europe have much better records of pedestrian fatalities or lack thereof, which is really something that all of us should strive for. So let's look at pedestrian racial disparities now. When you look at a population racial breakdown in the United States, 73% white, while when you look at pedestrian fatalities, it is only 63% white. Now, again, like the Black Lives Movement has always emphasized, the intent is not to say that any life, that a particular segment of life matter most. All lives matter, of course, but the reason for the Black Lives Movement is, to emphasize that very clearly Black individuals seem to be the ones being pinned down by law enforcement and seem to take the brunt of a lot of violations, if you will, of basic rights. So, again, any life lost is a life that we should obviously try to save. The point is there is overrepresentation of Black lives lost in the transportation sector and in the pedestrian fatalities numbers. So this whole issue of walking while Black, there are many different ways that we can try to identify an index. And this is one way, a pedestrian danger index. And based on that, you can see that Blacks are 40% more likely, to be in danger of being struck down fatally in pedestrian incidents. And that also holds true for American Indian or Alaska Natives, even actually slightly more than Blacks, but clearly disparity. And so the walking while Black issue comes up. And the scale of disparity has significantly increased. So when you look at, what happened to my slides here? Okay. So when you look at the scale of disparity over time, you can see that between I'm trying to navigate my slides over here. I'm having some problems, but essentially you can see that there has been a disparity in terms of the increase in deaths per 100,000 population, with Blacks, non-Hispanic members of our society taking the hit there. And the pandemic appears to have made things worse, and we're trying to figure this out. When you look at VMT, it has gone down, but in terms of the racial breakdown, there has been a 4% increase in pedestrian white fatalities, while a 23% increase in Black fatalities. Now, this could be an exposure effect, where many Blacks having jobs that they have to go to, even during the pandemic. And so it might have been a difference in exposure. It's possible. But when you look at, in addition to fatalities, there are some variations and disparities in hospital admissions, in length of hospital stays, etc. So despite, I'm going to try to, whenever I try to take out this thing away from my slides, it gets me back to something else. Okay. So despite a growing body of academic research, the public seems to be largely unaware of the issue of pedestrian fatalities and Black pedestrian fatalities in particular in the large scheme of things. So one of the big issues and questions here is, but hold on, what are the causes of this disparity? That's what we are trying to study in our scholarly work. Now, is this because of exposure? Is this because of cultural issues? Is this because of built environment? Is this because of pedestrian environment? No, exposure, Blacks use more of transit in the United States. You can see these numbers over here. And could that be because of that? Blacks walk more simply because they have less access to vehicles. Is it because of that? In terms of the younger population that seem to be more represented in pedestrian crashes and fatalities. Blacks tend to be younger in general. Is it because of that? And of course, is it a type of work? Minority groups, they require traveling even during adverse conditions, like during the COVID times. And is this causing an issue? So is this an exposure effect, which is a very valid question, or is this potentially a racial bias in yielding behavior? This was a study conducted by Khan and colleagues in 2017, where they noticed that motorists were seemed to be more willing to yield to white pedestrians in a crosswalk, but not so much for black pedestrians, which was an interesting experiment that was done, a simple experiment, but they did notice that black pedestrians were passed by more than twice as many cars as were white pedestrians. So is this some kind of a bias in our psyche that we are more willing to yield to non-minority pedestrians? Is this because of social resistance? The social resistance theory, originated in sociology and in behavioral science. The basic idea is that when minorities feel like their voice is not heard adequately in society, they develop a collective identity to oppose the basic ideas of that society. And in this context, there might be some pressure not to be seen as acting white, and that might lead to, why should I follow the laws and rules of a society that is not treating me in the way that I believe I should be treated? So, it could be because of social resistance, for example, non-use of seatbelt frequency. When we look at that, black respondents are more likely, it seems like, to not use seat belts. And so, there is this correlation between minorities wanting to more socially resist, and that gets manifested in the form of, potentially things like even crimes that we see. So is this a social resistance kind of an issue? Or is this a built environment issue? In Austin, Texas, when you look at areas with high percentage of minorities and low percentage of minorities, you can see that you have more of arterial roadway systems in high percentage minority areas. Population density wise, not surprising, you have a higher population density in high percentage minority areas. And then when we look at the pedestrian environment, black and non-black, you'll see over here that this on a scale of 1 indicating not a problem and 6 indicating an absolute barrier to walking, in the context of things such as poor lighting, missing sidewalks, not enough safe places to cross, it does seem like there is disparity in the pedestrian environment. So the basic idea is we need to identify the causes of disparity. So what is our research? I'm going to try to go forward quickly over here. This is just taking shape, but we are trying to assess the relative magnitudes of the many causes of disparities, among racial groups in pedestrian injuries. I mean, how much might be because of exposure effects? How much may be because of social resistance effects? And how much may be because of environment effects? And how much of this may be issues related potentially to through discrimination that all motorists have, in the transportation space. So we are undertaking the analysis at the level of spatial units, and we are trying to control for a lot of different things: exposure, resistance, built environment, and looking at how these impact whether a block group is majority black. So this will tell us if there is a paucity in pedestrian environment or a built environment in certain specific neighborhoods. But then using that along with all of these exposure, resistance, and built environment measures to examine the splits of black versus white pedestrian and deaths and serious injuries. So that's what we're trying to do. And after controlling for a whole lot of these effects, we're trying to see, is there potentially some, racial bias in addition to any biases that are prevalent in terms of investments, such as the pedestrian environment investment being much more toward specific areas which may be non-black. So we have a whole bunch of exposure measures, a bunch of resistance measures, crime rates, number of traffic violations, DWI statistics, and of course a lot of environment measures. We are doing this in the Houston area, and we have, we have started doing some descriptive analysis, but we intend to have much more of an econometric modeling approach, a multivariate approach to analyzing the impacts of various factors. We have started looking at some descriptive statistics in terms of exposure. You look at VMT, more in majority black areas, number of transit stops, more in majority black areas, population density, and clearly more in majority black, employment density, more in majority white, and percentage of zero vehicle households, much more in majority black. So these are exposure effects which could be causing it. These are resistance effects which, once again, seem to be a little bit more in majority black areas, as we would expect. And then we have environment effects, which are road network density, types of roadways, etc. So, the basic point of our analysis is, let's try to control as much as we can for all possibilities for why we have these disparities, and try to reduce all pedestrian fatalities and crashes. Of course, that's the goal, but try to see why we are having these disparities and get a clear sense of what is going on. So with that, let me end my presentation, and hopefully there is some time for questions, but even just open discussions. This is an open topic, and I would be very glad to hear thoughts and views on it.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre, for, as ever, very interesting presentation. And I think I should use my position here to ask you a couple of questions before we receive more from the audience. So, I mean, would we, or do we usually set our hypothesis or research questions before we set to do the research, and could this influence the findings?
That's the reason why we are trying. We know that there are disparities, okay, in terms of pedestrian fatalities. That is an observation that involves no hypothesis. Now, what we are trying to do is, why do we have these disparities? There are legitimate claims that these disparities are nothing but pure exposure effects, pure socioeconomic condition effects. But we just want to try to peel the onion, if you will, to try to track how much of this may be exposure, how much of this may be social resistance, and how much of this may be pedestrian environment. Again, the pedestrian environment issue is an observation. It's not a hypothesis. It is clear that, in terms of walkways, sidewalks, etc., there is the paucity in majority black neighborhoods relating to majority white neighborhoods.
Sure. And what I think the obvious thing, what can we do to change things? I think, as you said, there's been lots of observations and facts and statistics showing that there are inequalities in accidents and fatalities and all of that. And what is the way forward?
I think we just need to have many more studies trying to peel the onion. And like in many other behavioral studies, I suspect that as we start peeling the onions, we realize that there are layers and layers of these feeling that needs to be done. But I think that we need to identify what is going on. If it is a substantial portion of this can be attributed to poor pedestrian environments in specific areas, we know that there are countermeasures that can be done. But it's not simply our roadway geometric engineering countermeasures. I think that we also need to look at behavioral countermeasures. If we get a sense from our analysis that there is a true difference in the way we behave and how we treat a black versus a non-black pedestrian, that is something that we all need to absorb, appreciate, and do something about.
Sure. And I think one last point for me, are there any statistics or studies you've done like specifically on women, like female gender?
You know, there's been a whole lot of work. I think still work can be done in the gender area. There is a whole literature on women's issues in transportation. We have done a little bit of work in that, but there are many other scholars who have done a whole lot of work in that area. We would like to see as much emphasis on racial issues in transportation, and that's what we are focusing on right now. But I think your notion of whether there is an interaction effect between race and gender, you know, for example, are black women pedestrians viewed differently from, you know, black male pedestrians? Those are the kinds of things that we have not gotten into, and I don't know how much of it will go into in this study, but clearly legitimate pathways to study forward.
Sure. Right. Guys, are there any questions for Chandra from the floor? Because I don't seem to be able to access them or see them. Francis?
No, I don't think there are any questions.
No.
If you want, we can.
Shall I ask? Shall I take the floor?
But Wafa and all of you, the rest of you who are here, what is the situation in European countries? I'd like to get a better sense of that.
Well, I think it's very similar. I think that is why, we've organized the TDM symposium on that theme, and that's why the EU was funding a number of European projects, including the two projects which are jointly presenting their final recommendations and findings with the TDM symposium this year. So actually, what we are looking at, I mean, in Europe, I mean, there are obviously lots of similar observations and findings and statistics. And Glenn was talking this morning, also saying, are we blind or not blind? Are we not able to observe and witness the gender inequalities and inequalities in a number of criteria as well? And as I was saying this morning, that I think in TDM, which has been there for like few decades now, we've concentrated too much on the, or a lot on the methodological issues and the concepts, predict and provide, or predict and manage, and the methodologies and congestion charging and pricing measures and parking management, more than looking at the users and the issues related to the users, including, for example, gender equality and the behavior of the users, and what the all the statistics which shows actually higher fatalities and higher accidents for pedestrians of color, or and so on. So I think we ought to pay more attention and put more efforts to look at the users as well as the methodologies and the concept. because the users are, at the end of the day, are the main component which we need to save and like improve the transport facilities for. So I think we all agree, and there are opportunities and funding of projects and support, but there is still a huge gap, I think, in that area.
Good to know. Thank you, Bob.
So,
in fact,
yeah.
we have one question. You may have received it through the chat.
So I've got a question here, the American dilemma now, and then highly interesting. So that's a comment rather, yeah? Or would you like to comment on it, Chandra? The American dilemma now and then, highly interesting.
Yeah, you know, in terms of gender, that is evidence that not in the context of pedestrian fatalities necessarily, but for example, in the context of commutes, you know, who has the longest commutes? Statistics clearly show that women of color have the longest commutes, and they are the ones who are the most time poor, without a question. So in general, we have done a whole lot of work, Wafa, on gender considerations in terms of transportation and time poverty, as we call it. Women are way more time poor than are men. There was this scholar in the late 1980s who came up with the term of the second shift, which is to say that women go out and work outside the home, and then they come in and they also have to work inside the home. And there is still a clear disparity. We have looked at time use in particular a whole lot between men and women, and that continues to be an asymmetry between men and women in the amount of housework that is being done, regardless of the amount of work that is being done outside of the home. And in a recent article, we made this comment that it seems that, you know, in terms of our minds, you know, we are not sure that men are being more open and more egalitarian in their views in terms of women's roles generally in society, as much as they are just happy to see their women partners go outside and work. But it seems more like it is a cushion for poor financial times, more so than being more broad-minded and open-minded regarding women's role in society. So we made some comments about this in a recent time use study that we undertook, which still clearly shows that women are the ones who are very time poor, tend to be socially excluded because of that time poverty.
Yeah, thank you. I think so, and I think the point on the American side, I think maybe the Americans have always been maybe more open and more like expressing their issues and problems than Europe, for example. So Europe has been always politically more concerned or conservatives. So that's why a lot of these issues didn't come across. But another question from Benista, which I think you've touched on, what consequences for policymakers emerge from your research? So I think, yeah, I mean, you've mentioned that we need to be more focused and do more research in that area.
Yeah, so Wafa, I had written an op-ed about this about 4 years back, where the basic idea in my mind is when we are talking about improving pedestrian infrastructure and reducing pedestrian fatalities, there tends to be quite a bit of emphasis on engineering countermeasures. You know, how can I have crosswalks, sidewalks? How can I? But I think as important is just the psyche, behavioral countermeasures. In the United States, for example, you know, when motorists look at pedestrians or even bicyclists, that I believe is this tendency we have noticed, which is like, this is my right of way. What the hell are you doing bicycling in my right of way. So just this kind of behavioral countermeasures, talking to respect for all road users. I think these are kinds of issues that also need to be focused on, not simply engineering countermeasures.
Absolutely, and even engineering measures has to be engineered for everybody, not for a subpopulation. So even if the requirements are different for subgroups, we need to include everyone and that design for them. I think lastly, comment from Hilda, very interesting. We can talk about the USA as a whole. Are there any differences between cities and examples of good practice? And what about white minorities?
I assume the question about white minorities might be Hispanic whites as opposed to non-Hispanic whites. We are looking at that, but I would be curious to know what the definition of white minorities was in that particular question. But it's a little bit more difficult to distinguish between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic whites. We actually are struggling a little bit with that. Now, in terms of other cities, we have focused on cities in Texas, Dallas, Houston, and Austin specifically, but I believe that the overall United States numbers also show disparities between majority whites and other people of color. So this is not simply a Texas issue. I think it's a nationwide in the United States issue.
Sure. I think one more question. How do the solutions differ depending on whether underlying causes of racial inequality are due to exposure, environment, or resistance?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is even if it's because of exposure, it still means that there is some inequity in terms of lifestyle, in terms of quality of life, perhaps. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand better how much each one of these issues contributes to the observation we are noticing. And from that, I think based on each one of these, and they are interrelated, while we have separated out exposure, social resistance, and last one, they are interrelated. I think the policy issues moving forward has to be thought through carefully. But we are at the stage of let's first identify this, because I think that should be an important precursor before diving into things that we believe maybe, but we want to see how the data speaks.
Absolutely. I think we are at the stage of clearing the ground and finding out and seeing the real picture before. Then that would be the useful input to improve and do more. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we've exceeded the time, and I'm sure there will be more questions, but we can always send them to you with the speakers' names, and you can, I'm sure everyone can contact you personally. Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating presentation. Thank you very much for attending with us, and you've got more duties now to chair the next session.